Hey, this is Jonathan Gilliam. Make sure you go check out all my books. Start with the best-selling Sheep No More, The Art of Awareness and Attack Survival, and the 2 workbooks that are fillable that go right along with it, the Threat Assessment and Defense Assessment workbooks. Also, for your children, The Adventures of Team Little Bigs, a parent's book for children. Now, that's a book of pictures you give to your children, and you let them go through it, and in the pictures are lessons about security and awareness, and you, the parent, go over to teamlittlebigs.com and download the free lesson plans that go with each picture. All of this is a package that makes your life, your family more aware, safer, and able to look at yourself from the attacker's point of view. Sheep No More, The Art of Awareness and Attack Survival. It's 2 accompanying workbooks, and The Adventures of Team Little Bigs, a parent's book for children, and the lesson plans that exist on teamlittlebigs.com. And now, let's start the show. This is Jonathan Gilliam back in on the Experts Podcast. The truth has arrived. Now, I don't know if everybody was monitoring the news, and again, what gets put out on the news and what gets put out on social media sometimes can conflict a little bit in the way that this, especially the speed at which things are being confirmed. You're going to listen to this in the morning, but from what I'm gathering right now in Atlanta, there's been over 20. I was getting reports of 20 to 30 officers that have either didn't report to work or they just left because of what has happened to the officer there that was in the shootout the other day in the Wendy's parking lot. And just so you know, it doesn't really matter if somebody's conservative or liberal on television. You never know when they're going to switch to the other side, especially when they are an executive from one of those different agencies, DOJ, FBI. You just never know what they're going to say. And I'm bringing this up because I want to go to where I just saw this a second ago. One of the acting attorney general, that's who it is, Whitaker, who you may know, he's kind of the tough-looking guy with a bald head that had it out in Congress when he was sitting in front of Congress in a hearing. And really looks like a no-nonsense kind of guy, but he actually is quoted as saying that it's hard to believe that this killing was justified. Not that it was not justified. He's saying it's hard to believe that the killing would be justified in a court of law. Now, it's interesting coming from an attorney who, has never been a cop that I know of, and worked for the DOJ, which their attorneys, even when they said Comey was a Republican and Mueller, remember that. Their analysis of things quite often favor whatever is happening in the political world at the time. And I think that's a ridiculous statement because everybody that I've talked to that's been in law enforcement, including my own self, who when I looked at the video of this, it looked like a good shoot to me. But we'll talk more about that this week. I'm going to try to get a couple of the guys so you just don't hear from my opinion about this, but other opinions about this. But here's the thing, folks. This really does kind of goes right along with the precedence of what we're seeing in the country. You think this person's conservative, and then the next thing you know, they're falling towards the left. You see companies out there that you never associated with anything racial. I mean, Planet Fitness is by far, I work out at Planet Fitness when I'm on the road, and they're as far left as you can go. I mean, you can see it all over the wall, the no apology zone or whatever it is that they have up there. Yet they have to send out letters apologizing for not having enough people of a certain race in their executive positions. I don't understand why they have to apologize for these things. If you hire quality people who are qualified for the job, it really shouldn't matter what race they are. But anyway, we're getting to this point where whether you think you know somebody or you don't, there is a lot of strange things happening right now. People are afraid that are conservative or just middle. Maybe they never thought about politics before, but they're afraid that now I'm going to go back and look at my Twitter and make sure that I never said anything that would offend somebody. On yesterday's show, I showed you how the football coach for Oklahoma State went on an apology tour because he wore a One America News shirt when he was fishing, and it was on social media. It had nothing to do with his work. So as you see these things, a lot of what you're saying, and I've been saying this for many, many years in media, and as I explained before in a show, when you're in government, a lot of the times you cannot understand the reality of what's going on around you because your job is to show up and serve. And when you show up and serve, you do what you're told, and you're in a very militaristic rank structure, and so you don't walk off and say, and you can't conceive a lot of the times that person is a leftist, a socialist, is in agreement with people who are trying to overthrow the government. You just would never, ever think of that. But as we can see over the past 3, almost 4 years with President Trump, that is not the case. And when I got out of the FBI, I quickly started to realize that there was something up here. And I felt it while I was in there, but I couldn't see exactly what it was. And when I got out, I quickly started to realize that there was a movement. I was always calling it communism. And then after having my conversation with Drago about the reality of socialism and how that's what most people see, and they see the extreme version of socialism, and that true communism actually never gets realized. Before it ever gets to that point, it turns into a military state, and the synthesis that they want so they can have this utopia never actually materializes. And I started to see more evidence. It became very apparent to me that a lot of the things I was seeing while I was in the FBI, a lot of the people that I just couldn't understand where their mindset was, it's that it was being driven and affected by this leftist, socialist, kind of communist type of ideology in globalism, which is all the same basically. And then I wrote an article which never got published, an op-ed about the reality between somebody like Nancy Pelosi and AOC, is that one wants to go very quick into this communist movement, that'd be AOC, and Nancy Pelosi and the rest of them are very slow and methodical. And these are two different types of tactics in the intelligence community and how they work. And it's the same type of between a direct action force like the SEAL teams and the special forces in the Army who can go in and work with indigenous forces to work a proxy war, and it takes a lot longer and much slower and more methodical. So I figured, I see this, and I've been an operator on the ground and experienced this stuff, and now as I sit here as a civilian, my experience level lets me see the reality of that something is just not right. But I figured, this show's called The Experts, and I want to bring in people who have specifically looked at these things. And when I was talking to my buddy, Dr. Cody McGinnis, Cody is a military intelligence veteran, a doctor of clinical psychology, and an expert on disinformation and radicalization, and the president of Geopsych Consultants, LLC. We started talking about what's going on in the country and the way the pattern of things that we see and the way that media reports it, and how from an investigative standpoint, we sit back, or an academic standpoint, somebody who's a veteran standpoint, how we sit back and look at this, and things don't add up to the way that we're being told that they add up. And so I want to introduce Dr. Cody McGinnis, Cody, for coming on here, because I think he can speak to this where I have problems introducing people by their real name. So I think Cody can actually go into this much better. from not just an academic standpoint, but really from an intelligence standpoint of, I want to look at this from an intelligence operative. Now, I've had Scott Eulinger on here, who was a former CIA station chief. I'd like to have you guys together, but it's very interesting because of, what you've studied, what you've looked at, and how it brought you to see what you're seeing now. So thanks for joining us, Cody. Or should I call you Doc? Should I call you Dr. McGinnis? What do you want to be referred to on here?
Cody's fine, okay. Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me on, man.
So go ahead. At that introduction, you heard what I'm saying. And this blanket that was taken off of my head, it reminds me of Gunnery Sergeant Crouch. He was my drill instructor when I was in officer candidate school. He did this thing where he'd take us out, and it was our first week in there, and he just beating the crap out of us all week in officer candidate school. And then he would take us out, and he would make us go get our blankets and stuff from our beds, and we were out there, and we had the blankets over us. I remember him saying, and I've talked about it before on the show, where he said, when you pull this blanket off, get ready, because your life is never going to be the same again, and who you are changed. We take it off, and there's upperclassmen standing there with us to, kind of get us briefed up, and it was kind of a nice thing. Yeah. And I feel the same way. When I got out of the Bureau, and as things started to progress, I felt like a blanket was slowly being pulled off my head, and I'm starting to look around going, this is not the reality I thought it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So I started my military career from the strategic intelligence side, and eventually I switched over to a tactical intel program. And in that program, I served on 136 combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so I kind of got, early on in the military, I kind of got exposed to both the strategic and the tactical side. And immediately after I left the military, I decided I wanted to earn my doctorate in clinical psychology. And so I started to pursue my doctorate. And my goal there had been, I was really curious to see how could I branch the intelligence work with the psychology side of things. And fortunately, early on, as I was working towards my doctorate, I started to get involved in some research, developing profiles on lone wolf terrorists. So we were looking at the radicalization process. So what could cause someone to go from being a peaceful observer of their faith, taking on a more radicalist approach? And then from there, I expanded on to developing personality profiles of world leaders and helping others understand how the psychological components of leadership in any particular country tends to inform geopolitics in that country. And that's why I went on to develop geopsych consultants, so that I could help companies counter radicalization, propaganda, and disinformation by helping them to understand what an unfolding geopolitical situation is in any particular country where a business might be operating in, and then what are the personality characteristics at play of the leadership. But through all of that work, I got a pretty up-close view of the radicalization process, of the propaganda that foreign adversaries use, and of the disinformation process. And so I've been studying disinformation tactics used by our foreign adversaries for really a long time. And I guess more recently, I finally reached the point where I felt like I can't stand on the sidelines and watch the media just perpetually get their explanations of disinformation tactics wrong, especially, and I'll talk more about this, especially those used by Russian intelligence. There were so many errors that I was seeing in the media on the role that propaganda and radicalization, and particularly the role of disinformation, how that manifests in the present day in the U.S. And so I've reached this point where I've got to start calling it out.
So people, I think, are a little bit. They think when they read the news and they saw what was going on over the past several years that the whole Russian thing is just a hoax, that it's just something made up by the Democrat Party. Now, there's others that think it is the Democrat Party, including myself, that are the ones that actually have their relationship with Russians. So the two questions I have for you as we start off is, one, how dangerous are the Russians? What's the reality of their capabilities, and basically, are they still a threat? Because people think that threat went away when the Cold War ended, whatever that was, and that when that ended, that they just stopped being a threat all of a sudden. So are they a threat? What kind of threat are they? That's the first question. The second question is, are they actually the ones doing all this stuff, or are they just a tool for the actual people that are trying to not only change our country? I mean, I think there's clear evidence that what's happening in our country happened in South Africa. It's terrible in South Africa. It's happening in Australia, Spain, Great Britain. I'm really surprised that France has kind of been bold the way they are, standing against this movement that's happening. But it seems like it's much larger than just the United States. And is Russia just a pawn or a tool in that process?
Well, to answer the first question about the danger that Russia poses, and when I say Russia, it's important to note that, obviously I'm talking about Russian intelligence, right? The Russian intelligence apparatus. But to answer that first question, they absolutely pose an enormous threat to the U.S. and to U.S. interests. And I'll talk a lot more about kind of how Russian disinformation tactics are manifesting. The thing to keep in mind here, I think, is a year ago, the left they were screaming about Russian spies hiding around every corner. And now there really are Russian intelligence footprints around every corner. And, for the most part, the left seems to have largely disappeared on this issue. Look, I'm a libertarian, right? I have no interest in infringing upon the rights of peaceful protesters. And of course, and I shouldn't even have to say this, but it's absolutely important that we examine as a nation the senseless death of George Floyd. But here's the thing. Unfortunately, the conversation is no longer about racial disparities. That movement, that conversation has been hijacked.
So let me do that. Let me do this for you. I will make this disclaimer in this show that that George Floyd and what occurred with him and between the police is an issue that can be fixed in this country, but it is a societal issue. I've talked about it in this show several times. It's a societal issue. It's an issue within the inner city. It's an issue with law enforcement being manipulated and molded by leftists that actually have put leftist chiefs and sheriffs in place and politicians that make laws that put the cuffs on cops. And also law enforcement's inability to remain or become part of society where they're not just aggressors to everybody. That is an actual problem. But that is the actual problem that the United States has. And it's many different places. But that is an issue that is truly ingrained in the American society, I believe. That we can take and set completely aside because it has nothing to do with any of this other stuff that's happening. The protests, the riots, none of it. There are people involved that think that it does. And I would say there's many people, thousands, who believe that they're involved in this, the greater good, but they don't realize what they're actually involved with, the threat to the nation and the people that are actually leading the movement to defund police and to set up autonomous zones and to push. They don't realize that is a part of a bigger picture. So we'll just make that disclaimer and then we'll go forward from there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There isn't a lot that I agree with Susan Rice on, but when she talked about the other day, she talked about these outside agitators and the foreign influence turning these protests violent. Well, in this case, I happen to agree with her, except these outside agitators are largely coming from Marxist organizations that actually have been operating within the U.S. for a long, long time. So it's not something new. It's organizations that have been here that take advantage of situations like what we're currently experiencing in the U.S. I mean, and as you mentioned earlier, I know there are probably a lot of listeners to your show that they're going to hear the word Russia and immediately roll their eyes and dismiss the idea, and understandably so. I mean, I think the left has been crying wolf about President Trump being a secret Russian agent for so long that when Russian intelligence actually starts working hard to create chaos in the U.S., nobody wants to believe it. But the thing is, creating chaos that seeks to sow doubt about the legitimacy of our democratic process, chaos that seeks to exploit a pandemic and further weaken the U.S. economy, chaos that seeks to hijack movements intended to address racial disparities, chaos intended to ignite a civil war in the U.S. This is what Russian intelligence does best. So yes, absolutely, the Russian threat is the Russian intelligence threat is very, very real in this country right now.
And how effective are they?
Well, I mean, Marxism killed 100 million people in the 20th century, right?
Right.
And yet, when we look at violent rioting happening on the streets of America right now, Marxism is everywhere. There aren't people out there protesting Marxism. Right? There are people being influenced by Marxism. Mm-hmm. So, Russian disinformation tactics, it's all about the long game, but they are very, very effective. I mean, the conversation that, we need to be having in the U.S. right now is about Marxism and liberation theology, because if you want to know how do we explain this protest, how do we explain protest movements turning into violent riots? Well, in my opinion, the culprit there is Marxism and liberation theology.
So when we're looking at Marxism and liberation theology, how long I'm trying to build a picture for everybody. So, because everybody thinks that this is like just occurring and that the country's just falling apart. But yeah, this is a train, a slow moving train that has picked up speed over how long?
Well, I mean, Russian disinformation tactics go back a long time. I mean, the brilliance of disinformation, particularly Russian active measures and disinformation tactics is that to call any of it out makes you sound like you're simply another conspiracy theorist. And I can give you an example just to kind of give you a sense of how long, these seeds kind of play out, because that's what Russian intelligence, that's what they do, is they plant seeds. It's all about the long game. It's all about letting things play out over the course of, in some cases, 100 years. One example that comes to mind is a document, a publication called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And if I mention that to someone in conversation, you can imagine how they're going to respond, because it sounds like I'm going down this conspiracy theory route. Here's the thing about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was a document published by Russian intelligence at the beginning of the 20th century, kind of widely considered to be one of the greatest examples of literary forgery in the world. It was a document that essentially had plagiarized a political satire publication from 50 years before, involving Napoleon's ambitions for world domination. Now, here's what's interesting, though. The language of this document that was originally about Napoleon was changed by the Russians, by Russian intel at the time. They changed all the language and took out references to Napoleon and inserted references to Zionists. And what the document ended up looking like was that it looked like it was a true original document that detailed a plan that the Zionists were laying out for world domination. Russian intel spread this document around the world, and this still in the present day, so again, that was published beginning of the 20th century, and now in the present day, that same document continues to contribute to anti-Semitism worldwide. So, and this is all because of a forged publication from the Russians at the beginning of the 20th century. So when I say long game, they are planting seeds years and years and years in advance, hoping that they'll sprout and they can be used to undermine democracy in the U.S.
Wow. So this is nothing new, is what you're saying, and it's been around. And their tactics. This is the other thing I wanted to ask you about. Their tactics are nothing new either. It's not like they've invented a new form of warfare, and the United States has become susceptible to that new form of warfare. That is not what's happening.
Right. Absolutely. No. There's nothing new. There's nothing new to their tactics at all. I mean, they've if anything, they've just been perfecting them. The thing to ask ourselves is, why is it that you have these Marxist organizations comprised of mostly white college kids, not only hijacking movements that really have the stated intention of protecting black lives, but then you also see these Marxist organizations using protests as opportunities to recruit new members. I mean, why is it that the same organizations always seem to show up to protests that end up turning violent?
Right.
And we should talk about some of those organizations. But, and I can give you, another example that comes to mind. Everybody's familiar with Antifa, and they're familiar with the black bloc tactics, the masks, the black clothes. Just rewind back to, I think it was the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in, I think, 99. If you go back and you look at pictures of the protesters that were violent at that time, they're all dressed in the exact same type of clothing that you see Antifa wearing. It's all the exact same black bloc tactics. So, I mean, these tactics and the disinformation and the Marxist organizations, they've been around for a long time. They may go by different names, or in some cases, and this is the really bizarre part, is that in some cases you've got organizations operating in the U.S. that have been here for a long time, haven't changed their name, and yet, we haven't really done anything about it. I mentioned Antifa, but there are definitely some lesser-known organizations, lesser-known Marxist organizations behind the scenes. I mean, I wonder how many of your listeners are familiar with one example that comes to mind: the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. This is a Marxist organization that, get this, was actually charged with the Espionage Act in the U.S. in the early 20th century, which then led to one of its founders fleeing to the Soviet Union. Now, the IWW is alive and well in the U.S., actively participating in ongoing protests. And I can name group after group. You've got the Catholic Worker Movement. This name might be familiar to your listeners because Martin Gugino. Mm-hmm. He was the elderly protester in Buffalo who was pushed out of the way by police and fell over. So he's a member of the Catholic Workers Movement. Now, I bring him up. When I bring him up, I obviously I wish no ill will on Martin Gugino, and hopefully he recovers quickly. But here's the thing: it's interesting that Marxist organizations in the U.S. always manage to avoid scrutiny. I know a little bit about the Catholic Workers Movement because a few years ago there were news articles about two members of the Catholic Workers Movement in Iowa who were actually arrested for sabotaging critical infrastructure projects in the U.S., including burning and damaging valve sites on oil pipelines. So when you've got cases like that, the question to ask yourself, the questions we have to ask is, why would a Marxist organization like the Catholic Workers Movement be interested in trying to disrupt the U.S. energy market? And if you're familiar with Jeremy Scahill, founding member of the Intercept news publication, mm-hmm. He also happened to, he was also a Catholic, belonged to the Catholic Workers Movement. I bring him up because you might recognize the Intercept as the publication responsible for publishing the Edward Snowden leaks. I mean, and this is Snowden, who, by the way, continues to live a comfortable life in Russia. And I'll give you one more example. The Workers' World Party and its many offshoots. Something interesting about the Workers' World Party. At one point, the highest-ranking Soviet intelligence officer to have ever defected to the U.S. actually acknowledged when he got to the U.S. that the Workers' World Party was a KGB front operating within the U.S. And guess what? Workers' World Party still alive and well in the U.S., actively involved in the ongoing protests. So what we need to be looking at is Marxism and liberation theology. I mean, there are many, many more examples of these Marxist organizations getting involved in these situations in the U.S. and attempting to hijack them.
What is the other guy's name that was the reporter that worked with Edward Snowden? I'm trying to think of what his name is.
Glenn Greenwald.
Right. What's the deal with that guy? He seems to bounce back and forth, but do you think he was Snow? See, this is the thing I'm getting at with these reporters. Are there people in media? I mean, I've been in media, but I can't imagine that somebody who would assist Edward Snowden in doing what he did that would have any inkling of understanding, if they weren't a part of it, they wouldn't have any inkling of understanding of reality of who he is and what he was actually doing.
Right. Right. I mean, I remember when the Snowden leaks happened. I mean, there were all these people suggesting that it was really about civil liberties, and that no one was actually being harmed by the release of the Snowden documents,
Mm-hmm.
which is just a blatant falsehood. I mean, the idea that the Snowden leaks weren't affecting U.S. intelligence interests around the world. I mean, that's preposterous, and it was absolutely putting lives in danger. And so I don't know. I don't know much about Glenn Greenwald, but what I do know is that the idea that publishing the Snowden files was an innocent endeavor is absolutely false. And it's hard for me to believe that any informed journalist out there that did that would honestly believe that it wasn't going to be putting people's lives in danger. So yeah.
Now, when we see what's happening now, okay, with what's going on today, and so I want to again continue to paint this picture. We know that Marx and all these things started to gin up right after, which I find very interesting. There was, our escape from Great Britain. So in the 1600s and the 1700s, people were already here in the United States. Many of the founding fathers they were born here in the United States, which most people do not realize. And the interesting thing is I have a degree in psychology and a degree in political science. And it was never taught in political science that the founding fathers were born in the United States. And most people don't even realize that they didn't come here from Great Britain. They were under the rule of Great Britain. And so all this stuff was happening. They saw the reality of freedom. And I don't think they would have got that if they were on an island close to Great Britain, and that's where they were residing. But they were on a continent far away, and they, after a generation, they started to realize, the reality of freedom, of true freedom, and they wrote this remarkable set of documents, declared their independence, went to war, won their independence, and started this nation. And because of the way they drafted the Constitution, all men and women are on an equal footing when it comes to opportunity in their lives. But what's interesting to me is that it was not long after that. We're talking about a very short period of time where Marx and this Marxism, which is based in socialism and communism, how it started to flourish somewhat. I mean, they started to have activists, and then even Hitler was a socialist. I talked to somebody who's a historian. They were talking about how the left and the right, when we talk about that and progressives, that goes back thousands of years. The Greeks called people left or right on the aisle in which they sat in their Congress. But what we're seeing now with what's happening, I think people are wanting to see so they can understand how the recruitment process happens with people today.
Sure.
Is how different is what's happening. You've talked about the liberation theology and the Catholic group, and there's other groups out there. How much has their ideology changed over these hundreds of years? Because the United States and the Constitution has really remained firm. It's remained what it is, the Judeo-Christian values that our court system was built upon, that it is the fine thread that goes through our Constitution and our God-given rights. That has pretty much remained the same. There's been some amendments here and there. How much of this movement on the left, the leftist movement, has changed, or is it just the same? They've just adapted their tactics, techniques, and procedures to modern day.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think my best guess there is that when it comes to PTPs, it's the latter, that they've just adjusted them to the modern day. I mean, I've been kind of thinking in my head, if I was a foreign adversary trying to destroy democracy, what are the tactics that I would use. And I put together, I've got about 6 different points that I put together when I was thinking about the steps that you would take largely using disinformation and Marxist organizations on the ground to try to destroy democracy. And to your point, number one on my list starts with the state of education for college-age individuals in this country. I mean, to me, what seems to be occurring is that as critical thinking abilities decrease, which is happening in the U.S., it's been happening over time, is that we seem to be getting worse at critical thinking. So as critical thinking abilities decrease, I think the likelihood of endorsing something like fundamental Marxism increases, right? Because if you had the critical thinking capacity, you would be able to recognize that Marxism typically doesn't end well, right? But because you've got this situation in the U.S. colleges where critical thinking is going down and willingness to endorse Marxism goes up, you end up with substantial portions of entire generations that are now stuck in this sort of postmodernist Marxist ideology. And when I say postmodernism, it's really the postmodernism that leads to people referring to, maybe you've heard that phrase, my truth, right? Everything is about my truth. So suddenly people are saying all that matters is what I believe my reality is in the present moment, my truth. Now, when your reality is defined by how you feel in any given moment, you are exactly the type of person that makes a perfect target for something like Russian disinformation, for any country's disinformation, but particularly Russian disinformation, because similarly, Russian disinformation, it always begins with the narrative, right? And then reality is shaped around that narrative rather than reality informing the narrative. So you've got critical thinking going down, willingness to endorse Marxism going up. You're left with this postmodernist mindset where everything is about my truth. And then now you've got generations out there who they get their news from social media, and they largely get their news from headlines on social media. So they're not really combing through the content. They're not really employing critical thinking when they're reading the news. And that makes them really susceptible to disinformation tactics.
Now, it's interesting. Do you find it interesting, because I do, when you talk about the critical thinking and how that's decreasing, and yet our phones and the intelligence in our phones, we have smartphones now where, I mean, the computing power far outweighs the rockets that took us, the Americans, to the moon in 1969, and far outweighs the ability of any of the great philosophers back in the times of Socrates and stuff. I mean, people can look up almost anything right now. So you would think that their intelligence would be getting greater, but it's not, because the easier it is to get the information. Well, first of all, half of it's false information, but the easier it is to look it up, the less people actually work to understand that information, and they don't make critical analysis of the information because they just take it for gospel. And it's interesting to me how Silicon Valley is responsible for that. Now, I'm not going tinfoil hat on everybody and saying that Silicon Valley developed a smartphone to cripple everyone, but it is very interesting how far left Silicon Valley is, and how these cell phones and social media have literally destroyed the psyche of not just young people. It's everybody, really. Everybody. Whether it's, I'm as good looking as my best selfie, or I'm as smart as Wikipedia will allow me to be. That's basically what it boils down to now. And so anyway, I find that very interesting. But I want to ask you on a psychological standpoint, okay?
Sure.
When I look at the people that are carrying out the operations in modern time, and we have to take this critical thinking into account, and the lack of critical thinking that has evolved. I would think during the time, and I may be wrong about this because, who knows actually what history shows anymore. You can see that it's written by, as they said in Braveheart, written by the victors. But I find it hard to believe that Marx and Lenin and what's his name? Strotsky. Am I saying that correct? The guy that ran with Lenin and
Trotsky.
Trotsky. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That they were not critical thinkers, right? I don't know where they went wrong, if it was their narcissism or if it was a psychopath leading others. But we talked about something the other day about glory seekers, hero worshipers, lonely romantics, and radical altruists. And it was remarkable when you were talking about this. And I think this is an important thing, if you want to talk about this, about how young people who are not critical thinkers, and even older people now who no longer critically think because they just will look it up or they'll argue their opinion. Social media has done that. It's created, I don't know if it's true narcissism. You'd probably know this better than I do, but it's definitely a narcissism of opinion. They just think that they're right. And as long as it meets what they think is the way the world is, then they're right, and it doesn't matter what the experience of the other person is, they're wrong. But when we look at those four things, I think it really, when you were telling me that, it really explained the reality of where we're at now, because the smartphone and the computers and all these and media have made the citizenry in the world, not just the United States, so completely idiotic and incompetent. Well, let's say incompetent. Let's not, idiotic sounds insulting. Incompetent. They are so incompetent and have no ability to critical think that they fall back on these emotional types of whimsical, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like almost like fantasies in their life, that they're fighting the good fight, and that they're on the quest. And when you talked about the glory seeker, hero worshiper, lonely romantics, and radical altruists, it really hit home in the behavior that I see of these people. So could you go through and talk about what those are and the type of people that are at, that these people follow, whether it be celebrities, media personalities, politicians? It seems like those people in the power positions of influence have they all speak the same ideology. They all say the same things, but it seems like there's no commitment to values and to ethics and morals. And these people seem to just follow what they have to say with no question whatsoever.
Sure.
So
absolutely.
if you could just explain these four individuals, and then we'll talk about the people that they follow.
Sure. So this was research that we began developing when I was working on my doctorate, taking a look at the radicalization process with lone wolf terrorists. Now, I'm glad you bring it up, because you absolutely see a lot of the same characteristics in some of the organizations that I mentioned previously. And if you look at a lot of the kind of online posts that some of the Antifa kids are making, I mean, I call Antifa the cosplay revolutionaries. Right?
Well, I think they proved that in that autonomous zone. I don't know if you saw those guys. There's a video of them in cosplay outfits walking around as security.
Absolutely. So the four categories that you mentioned, and these are certainly not mutually exclusive, but the first one, the glory seekers. So and again, as you mentioned, Jonathan, underlying all of this is narcissism, right? And with narcissism, there's an inner void that you are attempting to fill, right? You're trying to avoid, in some cases you're aware of that inner void. In some cases it's more happening on more of an unconscious level, and so you're not even aware that it exists. But it's that inner void, and then the attempt to avoid that inner experience of something being missing or depleted that drives the narcissist. So if the glory seekers, these are individuals who they really are motivated by the idea of seeing their name in news headlines. When I was taking a look at lone wolf terrorists, there were plenty of cases where you had individuals who, prior to carrying out the act, which typically the act that they would attempt to carry out was generally unsuccessful because these guys they don't really have the training that they think they have. Right? There's a disconnect between who they really are and who they think they are. Right? But you often saw individuals who were really motivated by the idea of seeing their name in news headlines, and so it was a really exciting thing for them to carry out an act that would potentially make them famous. I'm thinking of even a recent example. I think it was, if I remember right, I've been following these cases of people of suspects that have been getting arrested after they get identified as they were the perpetrators who burned police cars and burned down the police precincts and the police precinct in Minnesota. And I know they're looking for, as far as I know, they're looking for 2 white suspects who burned down the Wendy's in Atlanta. And one example comes to mind of a guy that they just caught. He was hiding in, I think he was in Colorado when they found him, but I believe he was one of the suspects who burned down the police precinct. And he was actually on social media posting about working with a group creating Molotov cocktails so that they could burn down the police precinct. But you see him basically bragging on social media, and that's a great example of I want to be affirmed, right? I want to get some attention for this action. And this guy is so stupid that he's posting about it. And so of course that was one of the things that led to his downfall, but he couldn't help it. He needed to share with the world that he was this cosplay revolutionary out there. He needed the world to know. And that's because he was driven by the idea of people praising him for that action. So those are the glory seekers. You've got the hero worshipers. So the thing to keep in mind about narcissists is that narcissists, they seek to identify with those who they view as being equally as great or greater than themselves. And so narcissists are particularly susceptible to some sort of heroic figure, some sort of idealized figure that they can essentially worship. And so you might even say Karl Marx, for the Marxist organizations out there, would be this hero when it comes to the hero worshipers. When I was taking a look at lone wolf terrorism, one of the so-called heroes that kept coming up was Anwar al-Awlaki, and al-Awlaki's radical online propaganda that was all over the internet. I mean, there were a lot of people out there who, and I think he was fairly charismatic, knowledgeable, well-spoken. So certainly he made, for many of these individuals who needed a figure to emulate, he made a great figure for them to follow. And so again, they will only follow someone who is equally as great or greater than themselves. Typically it's someone that is greater than them who they would like to ultimately aspire to.
So you're saying that the followers themselves are also narcissistic, because it's obvious that these quote unquote heroes that they follow are often, and I've learned this since I got out of to be honest with you, I learned this when I got out of the FBI, that these people in positions of authority that are in the public eye, whether it be kings, queens, presidents, senators, congressmen, deputy directors or directors of agencies, secretaries of state, whatever, they are narcissistic in the way that I think they're narcissistic. I think some of them are psychopathic, to be honest with you. But whatever it is, they live a lie of telling the world that they are this great and this experience when all they have is the title. They have no experience that goes with it. And I heard this actually fascinating psychologist who was clinically diagnosed as a narcissist. And it was the strangest thing. He knew he was a narcissist. He wrote an article. I think he wrote a book as well. I read the article. and he was describing the reality of his motivation. It's like he was diagnosing himself. But the thing that really stood out about him was that, and I think this really plays into this, is that he said a narcissist can open up a gallery. For instance, a narcissist can say, I want to be a painter, and they will literally paint 400 pictures and open up a gallery and do everything that everybody else that says I'd like to be an artist would say they would do, but never do. They will actually do it. But when you go there, the art is relatively boring and does not provoke thought. And the same thing with a book. A narcissist may say, I'm going to write a book. They'll sit down and write the book, but it's unremarkable when you read it and actually quite boring. So they are capable of taking themselves to this point and making themselves look like, and that's a problem in media, because now they're put on and saying they ran for Congress or they wrote a book, they're an author, or whatever it is. But when you look at the reality, they're not really good at there's nothing remarkable about who they are or what they've done. Are those people in the leadership position? And are you saying that these followers are also narcissistic?
Absolutely. I mean, just because someone is a follower, I mean, they can definitely still be a narcissist, and many followers are narcissists. Again, because they're driven by this idea of, well, I'm going to be great, or I'm destined for greatness, or maybe I'm already great, but I can be greater. And maybe if I associate with this person, or, I make my life look great on social media. They're driven by this constant need for adulation. But just because they're a follower, that doesn't change that it can still be someone who's driven by that constant need for adulation. And if you think about social media posts where, the majority of the time people are posting or trying to frame their lives in the best light possible, right? So if you imagine narcissists on social media, and if what you start to see is this sort of one-upmanship, right? Where somebody's posting something that makes their lives look great. Well, and then the narcissist says, that person can't be living a life greater than mine. Well, I need to make myself look even better. And, each step of the way, it's like they're getting further and further removed from reality. But absolutely, just because someone is a follower, they can certainly still be a narcissist.
Now, where were you here when we left off?
So we did glory seekers, hero worshipers. So the next one, I'm going to save that next one for last,
okay.
Because I think that's really important for this conversation. So I'll skip the one after that, which is the radical altruists. So the radical altruists are those who they've convinced themselves that they're acting on behalf of besieged whatever population they identify with. Okay, so they believe that whatever identity politics they have associated with, they believe that particular group that they belong to is under attack. Okay, and it is up to them, solely them, to lead the revolution, to be the ones to save everyone, to save their besieged community. So that's the radical altruism. So they convince themselves that they're sort of martyr for the cause. And and it can be kind of funny though if you put a bunch of those radical altruists together in one room, because everyone suddenly thinks that they're the only they're the necessary martyr for the cause, and that they're the only ones who can save whatever population, whatever group they identify with. And it's kind of funny because everyone in that room is saying the exact same thing, that only one person can do it, and it has to be them.
So that's where I think you end up. It's interesting why you say this stuff, because when I reflect back on the videos I watched, especially yesterday, I was talking about the shooting that happened in New Mexico, and these protesters get louder and louder. It's as if they are trying to be that person that is the martyr, that person that is the hero or the leader and the loudest person there. And when you get a lot of those people there, it is chaos.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and you know, I should also make a distinction between, you know, a clinical narcissistic personality disorder, which is not necessarily what we're talking about. And really, we're talking about traits of narcissism. Now, someone could have those traits of narcissism and be driven by narcissism without necessarily meeting the criteria for that clinical disorder. So I mentioned that because I'm not talking about a diagnosis. I'm talking about the traits, though, the personality traits of narcissism. And individuals with a certain level of narcissism, they are perfectly capable. They can certainly turn violent. I mean, of course, you know, that's what we're talking about. Where initially, you know, this research initially came from profiles we were developing on lone wolf terrorists. You know, individuals who had either become violent or were attempting to become violent. So narcissists can absolutely become violent, and particularly when we start talking about a type of narcissism called malignant narcissism. But
so let's do this. Let's do this. Let's finish describing these four groups, and then we're going to actually talk about narcissism, because I think it's very important for people not only understand what narcissism is, but the difference between a narcissist and a person that has a calling to be their best. In other words, visions of grandeur versus confidence. Right.
Sure.
So I really, the reason, and I want everybody to realize this, the reason I'm diving into this stuff and you reached out to me is because this is the movement. This movement it's controlled by power players, but the bulk of the people that are involved fall into these categories, and that's how they're recruited to do these things that as an adult would sit back and say, wow, this is, or if they saw somebody that didn't believe in what they did doing the same thing, they would say they're violent, you know, those aren't protesters, those are rioters, you know, and so on and so forth. But they fall into this category where or into this mindset where they justify what they're doing, and that is done through this type of narcissism. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, to kind of segue into the fourth category then, and these are the lonely romantics. Now, I saved the lonely romantics for last because I think it's so relevant to what we're seeing with these these Marxist organizations that are attempting to hijack movements and turn them violent. What you have with lonely romantics are individuals who have been sold this sort of romanticized idea of being a revolutionary, a romanticized idea of being involved in some sort of revolution. You know, I think when I was developing this research, you know, I was looking a lot at a Somali population in Minnesota, where you had a number of families who had escaped Somalia to get away from violence being caused by Al-Shabaab over there, and had immigrated to the U.S. And an interesting phenomenon was happening at the time in Minnesota, which was that these families that had escaped Somalia came to the U.S. with their kids. Their kids were growing up, and within certain populations, or within certain neighborhoods and certain communities, there were actually Al-Shabaab loyalists who were working at like recreation centers and sort of like after-school programs, who turned around and recruited the same kids who had came to the U.S. to escape Al-Shabaab, and in many cases actually convinced these kids to go join Al-Shabaab and fight in Somalia. And what was the process there, the mechanism there, was that these kids were being sold this idea that they could be involved in a revolution, and that they could be this revolutionary figure, and that they were sold this idea that this is a cool thing to be a part of. And it's a very romanticized notion, because obviously, you know, when you got this Al-Shabaab recruiter that's talking to somebody about this romanticized idea of partaking in this revolution, they're not talking about the fact that these kids are going to go over to Somalia and become a suicide bomber. They're not talking about the violence and the bloodshed. They're not talking about the innocent people who are murdered by Al-Shabaab. They're just selling them what looks like, they're just selling them this really kind of cool, naive version of fighting, being of fighting in this revolution. You see that on social media now all the time, and of course you see that in what's happening with some of the violent riots that we're seeing, where you've got you've got the Marxist organizations who are just full of people who have bought into this idea that they're partaking in some sort of romanticized revolution. You just mentioned the autonomous zone, right? I mean, that's a prime example of this sort of romanticized idea that they're partaking in some sort of revolution without having the slightest idea of how they would actually go about doing that in real life.
Now, I don't know if you probably, I don't know, I haven't asked you about this, but when you throw drug use into this, such as marijuana, right, which it's phenomenal, man. When I look at all the stuff on Twitter, for instance, of all the people who are into this, like the push for this socialist movement, and really adamant about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm talking about white people. I'm talking about people who are freshly out of high school that are pushing this. And I look at their news feeds. It is inundated about marijuana activism. So are we looking at a group, a generation, or just a population of people that are narcissistic, have little to no critical thinking abilities, and are high? And how much does that play a part in it when somebody is influenced by a drug, whether it's a harsh psychedelic drug or just something that makes them blissful? How much do you think, or do you even want to make a statement on that? I mean, all these things, this combination of stuff creates what Saul Alinsky himself called useful idiots. I think he took your 4 categories and the social media and the narcissism and the drug use and threw them all into that and just called them useful idiots.
Right. Yeah, and it was actually the term useful idiots, I believe, actually came from Lenin, well before Saul Alinsky used it. But yeah. I mean, that's what we're seeing is these cosplay revolutionaries who are functioning as useful idiots. And
I would have to think though that the typical useful idiot back in the day of Lenin and Stalin and Marx were people that really suffered, were really oppressed. They worked in environments that, like in the factories back in those days, it was people literally died at work. No one in the United States, unless they're a sex slave or listen, I grew up extremely poor with outhouse and pump water. I grew up really poor. But I cannot say that I ever felt as though whatever I wanted to be was not attainable. So I know the oppression of poverty, but I don't know the oppression of not having a father. Well, my father was gone, but my mom was so great that she kind of, filled that void in telling me that I can be anything I want to be. So I never felt that oppression of the social mechanism that seems to exist in the inner city that tells people you can't achieve, you are oppressed, these things are happening to you. And so when I look at what is being said and what is being done by these people that are seemingly clueless as to the reality of what's going on and what they perceive as perception, I never felt that because I just simply had somebody telling me all my life that you can be whatever you want to be.
Sure.
I don't know if that's a question or a statement.
If we're talking about the Marxists, right? If we're talking about the Marxist organizations, and there's definitely some parallels here between Marxism and the narcissism, and so if you take someone who has these narcissistic features and the decreased critical thinking, and they've bought into Marxism, well, there can be a need to have some sort of oppressive force that they feel like they have to push back against. Mm-hmm. So for the Marxists in particular, and again, I'm not talking. we're not having a conversation about racial disparities. We're having a conversation about the white woman that burned down the Wendy's. We're having a conversation about, the punk that was bragging on social media about creating Molotov cocktails to burn down police cars. Someone like that, they need to feel like they have an oppressive force that they can push back against. And in the absence of one, they're going to make one up.
That's
in the absence.
Is that narcissism? Is that narcissism right there?
Absolutely, yeah. In the absence of an oppressor, they'll create one, and if that oppressor is serving the function of giving them a sense of importance and fulfilling that inner void, well, then certainly there are elements of narcissism there. Absolutely.
It's interesting because a lot of the people that I see that are on social media, that are not the bots. There's this whole bot thing that's going on that General McChrystal and DARPA and this other guy created that is being used. If you have a conservative voice or you say something that doesn't agree with the leftists on social media, they will come after you. I put a picture of myself I talked about this, where I'm laying on the bed with two guns, and I said in the caption, every night they have this whole bed, but they insist on cuddling. It was a joke, and it was, and I'm a Second Amendment guy, I'm a trained killer. Sure. So over 10,000 comments, and all of them were extremely grotesque and hate-filled. And so basically what I'm trying to get at is that it seems like when we look at the people in the comments that they're making, not the bots, mm-hmm. but the mm-hmm. other people, they fit into this category so perfectly that, and this is the other question about, is it narcissism or is it something else? Where they, and what category would this fall into here? Social media, when you look on there, or just in conversation, people that follow 100% of what they are told. Their narrative is exactly what's being told on the radio. It's exactly what they get from the celebrities on social media. It's exactly what the left is pushing out. What is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I something that I think is worth saying is that because we are a free country, that makes us, unfortunately, more susceptible to disinformation, right? Because, I don't know if we can really even say this anymore, but because ideally we're living in a country without extreme censorship, and again, now I guess I can't honestly say that anymore, but because we're living in a country where we're supposed to have freedom of speech, that ultimately means that anyone can post anything on social media, and that also includes individuals who are taking advantage of our freedom of speech by, as you mentioned, the bots, but also just using disinformation tactics to try to throw out messaging that's going to appeal to all sides, all ends of the political spectrum. So people are, because of the freedoms that we have, that we're supposed to have in our country, we are, as a nation, I think, more susceptible to disinformation tactics. And then, combine that with an education system that has been promoting Marxism for a long, long time now, the decrease in critical thinking abilities, and then the ease with which you can sell a college-age individual who has bought into Marxism this idea of them being this sort of important revolutionary figure. I mean, it creates this it creates this situation where people are easily manipulated and easy to control, and ultimately it makes it very easy to create some sort of civil war situation within our nation. I mean, and that's the end goal ultimately. I mean, that's what Russia would like to see with disinformation, is ultimately to see a civil war break out within the U.S. Mm-hmm. But in order to get to that point, they had to create and they had to promote a situation where people could easily be manipulated. And part of that is taking advantage of of narcissism. Part of that is taking advantage of the sort of one-upmanship that you see on social media, but definitely taking advantage of so many people out there that have an inner void and a need to fill that. And, it just happens to be convenient that here's something that will fill it. You can be a Marxist revolutionary.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit further.
Sure.
Narcissism. What is clinical narcissism? Are there levels of narcissism? What are we looking at here, and how has it become so prevalent in this country? And do you think that this is one of the greatest threats to our nation? In other words, is this one of the things that these revolutionaries, and whether it be Islamic fundamentalists or leftists, is this something that has created a national crisis?
You're talking about the level of narcissism. Has that itself created a national crisis?
Yeah, and it's opened up somehow. I mean, this is fascinating from a psychological standpoint, because
Sure.
What you're describing seems to affect, the vast majority of the population. And I can't think that it was like that before the advent of television, computers, and especially social media. So what is narcissism? What is clinical narcissism? Are there levels to it? And am I wrong in saying that this is like an epidemic of susceptibility? So in other words, I know that's not clinical, and don't judge me on that at all, but it seems as though there's an epidemic going around in the country that people are just susceptible to whatever person is screaming the loudest and is the most, and who has been indoctrinated the most. I mean, it appears to me, when I look at the reality of what's going on in this country, there's clearly, you don't have to make a clinical diagnosis. You can sit back and look at this and say, there is obviously something occurring in this country where people are being influenced, or something has occurred along the way where people have become so divided that they don't critically think. They either fall to the left or the right, and they typically follow the people who are the loudest. So I guess the question here is what is actual narcissism, and is this something that is being programmed possibly into people? Where is this coming from? Because unless I'm wrong, I don't remember seeing narcissism to this extent, both by the leaders and the followers. Whereas it seems like if we look back in, 100 years ago, it seems like when I look at those people and analyze it, that those people were following out of a sense of desperation. Like they were not in a position to lead, and they had to follow whoever was going to give them the best life. It does not seem like that anymore. It seems like it's an ideological noose around their neck, and they're being convinced that, hey, the pot of gold is over there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think maybe one way to look at this is, and again, we're talking about features of personality, of in this case, features of narcissism, right? It's important to keep in mind this idea of features, because if you think about, if you're online and you're on a website and you see an ad that seems tailor-made to your interests, maybe it's an ad that's similar to a product that you recently bought, or an ad that is in some way related to some research or something that you've been looking up online. Well, it's because it is tailor-made to you, right? It's an algorithm that has decided that this is an ad that we're going to post in front of you because you're most likely to respond to that. Well, disinformation tactics used by foreign adversaries kind of works in the same way, in that our foreign adversaries are taking a look at underlying personality features, okay, and they're thinking about how do they tailor messaging in a way that's most likely to get noticed by someone with a particular set of personality features. So it's just like you seeing that ad for some product that maybe it's something you didn't even know you needed, but oh wow, I definitely need that now. Well, similarly, you're seeing messaging online that's designed to try to influence particular segments of the population. And so if you think about the online disinformation combined in conjunction with the people that are on the ground trying to recruit individuals into this Marxist ideology, I mean it's kind of the perfect weapon, right? I'm gonna have this organization that's going to try to recruit individuals who may be interested in, this is why they recruit at a lot of protests, right? Because they might find somebody who's interested in some sort of social justice cause, and then they use that to their advantage. They exploit that by reeling them into a Marxist ideology, getting them to join a Marxist organization, and then simultaneously, that person now that's been talking to someone on the ground who's getting kind of pulled into this Marxist ideology, they're also starting to see online. Their eyes are they're seeing more and more online propaganda that's sort of tailor made to that particular type of person. Mm-hmm. And so in both on the ground and online, when it comes to disinformation, there really is an element in there of exploiting personality features that we all have, by the way. I mean, we are all susceptible, but with what we're seeing right now in the U.S. with violent protests, with Marxists, that is a particular segment of the population that has particular personality features that is particularly susceptible to a particular type of disinformation.
Now, when we look at narcissism and the definition of it, that talks about people that have an inflated sense of self-importance, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times there's a extreme basis for how inflated that sense of self-importance is. But I think you and I both haven't been in the military. What you just said there is very interesting, because you said we all suffer from some of these things. And I know that when you're in the military, and I remember in The Replacements, the movie The Replacements, Gene Hackman, who was a Marine, he said that winners always want the football. And people who strive for success always will eventually want the football. They will begin to see themselves as their potential. Sometimes it's before their potential, and sometimes you reach your potential, but you go to another agency, you go to another job, and you get slapped in the face, and you realize all of a sudden there's always people over you, no matter how good you are. So, I think one of the problems that we see in today's society and the way that people are following this nonsense is that they have an inflated sense of self-importance with no experience and no commitment behind them. And that's one thing I definitely think is part of this. You can speak to this, is that that young people, especially that have never done anything, are extremely susceptible to people making them sound like, if you will do this, you will be amazing. And it really comes down to that. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But what's the other part that's actually fascinating about this is how I've talked to people who were captains in the Navy. That's an 06, and they're equally as snowed. Like, they have the same leftist ideology as somebody who's 18 and just got out of high school.
Yeah.
What do you think? I don't know if you can agree with that. See, I know that you're looking at things from a clinical standpoint, and for me, I'm free to say whatever I want, because I can go into these different tirades, because as my mind thinks, and these things, especially talking to somebody like yourself, it opens my mind up quite a bit, and it allows me to think as I talk. But I'm not trying to get you and pin you into to classifying somebody into a position, but you have to admit, from a clinical standpoint, what is happening in this country, it seems unique, unless I'm wrong. It seems like we never had social media before in history, We never had smartphones before in history. And I think along with that has come an evolution of this thing we call narcissism, and the thing that where people used to watch a movie and before that they just heard a story, or they saw their elders when they were in a tribe, 100, 200 years ago, and they would get a sense of, I want to be like that person. And now they're literally being told through mass tweets or whatever that you are that person. If you retweet this, you are great. If you have this picture up and you look like this, you are great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the key features of narcissism is, fantasies of unlimited success and brilliance. But, an important distinction to make, I think, is narcissism. It's not necessarily always bad. If it's functioning, if it's something that you can utilize in a way that drives you, if you believe that you could do something great, and because you maintain that belief, you're going to work until you get to that stage of your life where you've accomplished whatever that great thing is, then you've figured out a way to allow narcissism to be healthy for you. But I mean, and narcissism, of course, it's just one amongst many personality traits, personality diagnoses out there. But it's not necessarily something that's always bad, but it can be something that can influence someone without them even being consciously aware that they are being influenced. So there are a lot of people out there with features of narcissism who they have that inner void. There's something empty, something hollow, something missing internally, and there can be an unconscious attempt to fill that. So they're not even aware that they're being sort of controlled or driven by that unconscious process.
Gotcha.
And so, and that may very well be at play as well with individuals who turn to something like Marxism. They may not even be aware of the fact that there is some sort of underlying void that they are attempting to fill. And, next thing you know, they they're subscribing to this Marxist ideology and, potentially partaking in violent riots. Next thing you know, they're burning a police car down, and they didn't even realize along the way that this process, which is really a type of radicalization, was happening for them because they were driven by an unconscious process.
Now, do you think, is there a reason why young college students are so susceptible to this? It used to be college students, especially back in the 70s and the 60s. Now it's gotten even younger. Is there a reason why they're so susceptible to this?
I think that's a complicated question. I mean, certainly I think you have to look at the role of academia. You have to look at college professors and the number of college professors, which is a ridiculously high number that subscribe to whether it's socialism, Marxism, or just outright communism. And that's definitely in abundance on college campuses. So you've got the role of the professors. You've got, the role of certainly the role of social media, where interpersonal relationships, meaningful interpersonal relationships, are often getting replaced by some sort of pseudo relationship that's not real, but it's just based off of social media posts. I'm talking about people who they may get together with their friends, and they may hang out in person every now and then, but largely their interpersonal interactions are based off what gets posted online and their online relationships and those online interactions. And so I think there's something to be said for the role of social media in changing the way people meaningfully engage with others. Mm-hmm. You've also got, along with that, you've got a lot of people who they're just less interested in getting out and experiencing the world because they feel like they've sort of substituted in-person experiences and life experience with a belief that they are experiencing the world via social media and via online networking and online relationships. And so I think there's definitely something to be said for the role of social media in decreasing, especially younger and younger generations' interest in establishing close interpersonal relationships. And then, like I mentioned before, the decrease in critical thinking abilities absolutely contributes to it as well. I mean, so it's really, you combine all of that, you get kind of this perfect storm where you can see how somebody is more susceptible to, messaging that is tailored to them, and individuals trying to convince them that, they could achieve greatness without actually putting in the effort to achieve any sort of greatness.
Yeah, that seems to be something that has really grown in, not, I wouldn't say popularity, but it's like become just a part of the way things are now. I want, therefore I should be.
Right.
And in these types of social media, these types of societal issues, they can actually go out and protest and stand and be told that they are a part of the solution when they in fact have no solution whatsoever.
Absolutely, and that's how they become useful idiots. Absolutely, I mean that's where you get people who are getting manipulated, and maybe they started out with a legitimate interest in trying to address some sort of disparity or some sort of social justice issue, but you factor in all those features we've talked about, and it doesn't take much for a foreign adversary to pull them into that process, to pull them into the disinformation and to make them susceptible to the propaganda.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about today about the reality of the psyche behind the people that are followers, the people that are the leaders. We've talked a tremendous amount about how much narcissism actually plays in this, which is very fascinating to me because I've screamed narcissism over and over again when it comes to the people that are in charge. I mean, Washington D.C. It's unbelievable. I know you are a doctor of clinical psychology, so you don't want to make any diagnosis because that goes. You're one of the people that actually sticks to the rules and doesn't go around diagnosing people. But Washington D.C. is out of control with people who love themselves, but are full of nothing and no solutions. 40 years in positions, they've done nothing, but they've become celebrities. So why don't we do this? I think there's enough for people to chew on and think about. I want to have you back tomorrow. What do you think is that we should go from here, and let's kind of tease everybody so they understand where we're going with this.
Sure. Well, we've largely been focusing on the protests that have turned violent, but I think, just to get a sense of the scale of disinformation tactics that are being used in the U.S. and why there is this sort of perfect storm happening in our country right now that leads me to that. At the start of this podcast, you asked that question about the danger that Russia plays. Well, we've talked about the protests, but we should also take a look at disinformation in relation to COVID-19. We should take a look at circumstances or the role of present circumstances in trying to elicit a reaction from the president that certain individuals want to see elicited in the president because they want him to respond in a way that would perpetuate their ultimate plan or their interest in seeing a civil war break out in the U.S. And the other thing too is, it might be worth it for us to talk about the role of disinformation in undermining our democratic process, which is really the Russian effort to convince a large portion of the public that the government is illegitimate and that their votes don't actually count. Because there's been a lot of falsehoods put out there by mainstream media about Russians involved in this or involved in that, and Russian disinformation this, and the reality is that the Russian intelligence apparatus isn't careless. Okay, the Russians, they don't leave a trail of breadcrumbs unless there's a bear trap waiting at the end of it. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be worth it for us to visit that when we talk next.
Okay, that sounds good. I think what we'll do is we'll just stop it there for tonight. And I think this is a conversation, especially after letting people listen to it, tomorrow, or as they get up and they're going to listen to this and they may have questions, they'll DM me. You can find me at Jonathan at @JGilliam_seal on Twitter, and Jonathan T. Gilliam on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. This is also available on YouTube, not just every other platform that podcasts are available. So, Dr. Cody McGinnis, again, I like to point out your experience because the show's called The Experts, and you're not just somebody who has an opinion. You're actually somebody who was a military intelligence veteran, and you're a doctor of clinical psychology and an expert on disinformation and radicalization, which we're going to get into more. I think this show really kind of sets a foundation so that people can understand how these things are actually possible. How did Jim Jones convince all these people to drink Kool-Aid that was poisoned and on purpose? They knew it was poison and die down in Ghana, French Guiana, I think is where that happened. I think that's right. And killed all those people back in whenever that was. I should look this up before I actually bring this up. But how does this happen? How did Charles Manson convince people to go and kill people? He didn't actually kill. They killed. And I think what we see, and you may agree or may not agree, but from my opinion, what I'm looking at, I'm seeing this stuff on a massive scale that would not have been possible if social media and mass communications and mass media were not present, and if there were not experts on disinformation and radicalization, which you actually study. So what we'll get into tomorrow is more about that. How does that sound?
I'm looking forward to it. It was an absolute pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me on, man.
You got it. And so for everybody else now, as I close out this show, do you fit into one of four categories? Are you a glory seeker? Are you a hero worshiper? Are you a radical altruist who believes only you can save everyone? Or are you a lonely romantic that is driven by the thought of the quest and the greater good? You see, it's not the fact that you want to achieve the greater good or that you are somebody who thinks that only you can save everyone. The fact is, if you are a narcissistic type of person, somebody who has to be noticed or be a part of something so that you're noticed because you're missing fulfillment in your life, you have the potential to be indoctrinated and manipulated. And that is what's happening to the masses by the people in power on the left. I'm Jonathan Gilliam. This is The Experts. The truth has arrived. Peace, and we're out of here.